Welcome back to the Words of Others podcast reading series. We're ready to dive into the next leg of our exploration of Cory Morningstar's research into the NGO industrial complex. This is Act 4 of her series called The Manufacturing of Greta Thunberg, titled For Consent, The House is on Fire, and the $100 Trillion Rescue. I'm not going to give too much preamble today. I think we should just read this puppy. This is something that Cory published at the beginning of February in 2019. I'll be reading from the Wrong Kind of Green website, which is kind of the flagship website that Cory publishes most of her work on. Additionally, you can also check the website titled The Art of Annihilation, and she seems to publish her work in tandem between these two websites. But let's dive in. This is Act 4 of the 6-part series, The Manufacturing of Greta Thunberg, For Consent, The House is on Fire, and the $100 Trillion Rescue. If you don't recall Act 3, Cory offers a little synopsis of what she got into in that piece of this series. She says, in Act 3, I deconstructed how Al Gore and the planet's most powerful capitalists are behind today's manufactured youth movements and why. I explored the We Don't Have Time Thunberg connections to Our Revolution, the Sanders Institute, This Is Zero Hour, the Sunrise Movement, and the Green New Deal. I also touched upon Thunberg's famous family, in particular Thunberg's celebrity mother, Milena Ehrnman, who is the World Wildlife Fund's Environmental Hero of the Year for 2017, and her August 2018 book launch. I then explored the generous media attention afforded to Thunberg in both May and April of 2018 by SvD, one of Sweden's largest newspapers. In Act 4, I examine the current campaign now unfolding in, quote, leading the public into emergency mode, unquote. More importantly, I summarize who and what this mode is to serve, and that's what we're going to read right now. Shaping a Global Architecture in the Age of the Fourth Industrial Revolution. And here's a quote. 15 minutes of fame is short-lived media publicity or celebrity of an individual or phenomenon. The expression was inspired by Andy Warhol's words, quote, in the future, everyone will be world famous for 15 minutes, end quote, which appeared in the program for a 1968 exhibition of his work at the Moderna Museet in Stockholm, Sweden. As Greta Thunberg is the founding block of this particular story, revisiting Sweden with the above observation feels like a good place to start part 4 of this series, where we deconstruct the ongoing marketing campaign with the most recent activity. Let's begin. And here she's got a photo of Greta Thunberg with a variety of individuals, including Bono. Let's see here. We'll read the quote. January 25th, 2019, quote, finally, we have to applaud the lineup for Thursday's lunchtime panel. Mark Benioff was joined on the stage by Jane Goodall, Bono, teen climate activist Greta Thunberg, diplomat and environmentalist Christiana Figueres, president and CEO of Sompo Holdings Kengo Sakuradu, and Will I Am. What a crew. Photo by Jeff Elder, source from the 10 best moments from Davos with Salesforce. And you may know that Mark Benioff is the CEO and founder of the software company Salesforce, which is a global company and a huge employer in my neck of the woods here in the San Francisco Bay Area. On Thursday, January 24th, 2019, Greta Thunberg took part in a lunch panel presented by Mark Benioff at the World Economic Forum in Davos, Switzerland. Benioff is the CEO and founder of Salesforce, as well as a co-founder of Breakthrough Energy, which is nuclear, with Bill Gates and other kindred billionaires. Also on the panel were Jane Goodall, United Nations Messenger of Peace, Bono, U2 lead singer and activist, Will I Am, Black Eyed Peas founder and philanthropist, and the young Greta Thunberg, who made the following statement.
Some people say that the climate crisis is something that we all have created, that is not true. Because if everyone is guilty, then no one is to blame, and someone is to blame. Some people, some companies, some decision makers in particular have known exactly what priceless values they have been sacrificing to continue making unimaginable amounts of money. And I think many of you here today belong to that group of people.
Thunberg's words were quickly launched into the international stratosphere of global media outlets and social media. From CNN, January 25, 2019, quote, "On Thursday, Thunberg gave an impromptu speech at a lunch with a star-studded guest list that included music stars Bono and will.i.am, Salesforce CEO Mark Benioff, former Goldman Sachs president Gary Cohn, and an array of bankers and investors. She roasted them." Here it is vital to note the usage of language, impromptu and roasted. And then another quote from the publication Pluralist from January 28, 2019. Quote, "Greta Thunberg reportedly took a 32-hour train from her home in Sweden to the Swiss retreat and camped out in 0 degrees Fahrenheit temperatures to deliver an impromptu roast of the celebrities and economic titans. In a speech at lunch, she accused the high-profile guests of causing the warming of the planet that they had spent the prior several days grandstanding about fixing." End quote. As demonstrated in the above talking points, there is much emphasis from the international media to establish the idea that Thunberg's speech was spontaneous. As we will illustrate, it was not. This is merely an example of effective storytelling being put into practice, as orchestrated by the NGOs and corporate alliances that are handling Thunberg. On January 22, 2019, 3 days prior to the impromptu speech at the World Economic Forum, a video was uploaded onto YouTube by Uphill Media. Uphill Media is the continuation of Bernie 2016 TV and Political Revolution TV. They're a 501c3 nonprofit independent media network focused on informing the electorate through engagement on the internet, and that's a quote from that organization. In this video of Thunberg speaking, filmed prior to her traveling from Stockholm to Davos, the key talking points within the message, and that's at 26 seconds in, are almost verbatim to the impromptu speech at the World Economic Forum. And I'm going to play that video for you real quick.
Some people say that we are not doing enough to fight climate change, but that is not true. Because to not do enough, you have to do something. And the truth is, we are basically not doing anything. And yes, some people are doing more than they can, but they are too few and too far from power to make a difference today. Some people say that the climate crisis is something that we all have created, but that is just another convenient lie. Because if everyone is guilty, then no one is to blame. And someone is to blame. Some people, some companies, and some decision makers in particular has known exactly what priceless values they are sacrificing to continue making unimaginable amounts of money. I want to challenge those companies and those decision makers into real and bold climate action, to set their economic goals aside and to safeguard the future living conditions for humankind. I don't believe for 1 second that you will rise to that challenge, but I want to ask you all the same. I ask you to prove me wrong, for the sake of your children, for the sake of your grandchildren, for the sake of life and this beautiful living planet. I ask you to stand on the right side of history. I ask you to pledge to do everything in your power to push your own business or government in line with a 1.5-degree world. Will you pledge to do that? Will you pledge to join me and the people all around the world in doing whatever it takes?
Incidentally, that phrase that she utters at the end of the video, "whatever it takes," is also listed as a hashtag in a caption across the screen several times during the playing of that video. So, This was not lost on the World Economic Forum organizers, whom, in a concerted effort with Greenpeace and Extinction Rebellion, were already sharing the Swedish e-commercial within the World Economic Forum event and on social media prior to the Salesforce lunch panel where Thunberg would cite the passages for media. The attempt by the media and forces at play to frame the speech as spontaneous, regardless if it was deliberate or not, evokes a layer of childlike authenticity by the messenger, if not the message itself. In spite of the motive, this is disingenuous to say the least. January 23, 2019, Extinction Rebellion played the same video. And then Greenpeace International on January 22, 2019, through their Twitter account, shared that particular video that I just played. Back to Cory. This compounds with other earmarks of a well-orchestrated media campaign. On December 15, 2018, Thunberg was thrust into international stardom following a speech at the COP24 in Katowice, Poland, that was published on December 15, 2018, by Connect for Climate, a global partnership program under the World Bank, and other outlets. The video quickly went viral. The speech, as described by Quartz on December 15, 2018, is representative of how global media framed the event to the public, and here's a quote from that piece. Quote, 15-year-old Swedish climate activist Greta Thunberg minced no words at the COP24 climate talks in Katowice, Poland this week. Speaking to the assembled countries Wednesday at the most important climate negotiating meeting since the Paris talks in 2015, in a speech lasting under 5 minutes, Thunberg castigated leaders at the talks for decades of inaction and too small steps in the face of climate crisis, end quote. Yet a poor editing job in a Swedish newsroom inadvertently revealed yet another inconvenient truth. There was almost no one in the auditorium when Thunberg spoke. Such inconsistencies between the real intent of the World Economic Forum, Globalization 4.0, shaping a global architecture in the age of the Fourth Industrial Revolution, and the reframing for public perception are best captured in the following images shared on social media. And here's a little image of Greta Thunberg with Jane Goodall. This bit of social engineering is stunning in its blatancy. Like magic, the telling word Salesforce and the phrase the Fourth Industrial Revolution no longer appear in the image, and that's true. She's shown two versions of the image. One where Greta is with Jane Goodall with a backdrop, typical that you see in many public events with the Salesforce logo, and then some text underneath it that says the Fourth Industrial Revolution. But then the next one, they've got that scrubbed, and just a quote from Jane Goodall above the photo of Jane with Greta Thunberg. Gone are the obvious contradictions between the unprecedented magnitude of precious earth metals including coltan and cobalt, a key requirement for the Fourth Industrial Revolution, which the mining of has decimated the chimp population Goodall claims to advocate for. From the Jane Goodall Institute, quote, many of the metals and minerals used in these technologies are extracted from threatened chimpanzee habitats across the Congo Basin. Control over these resources has also fueled conflict among people, conflict that has resulted in the deaths of more than 5 million people. Such is the primary role of the nonprofit industrial complex. The climate mobilization. Quote, we launched at the People's Climate March in 2014 as the first group organizing for a World War II scale climate response, an idea that had emerged as a hidden consensus among climate experts, unquote. Here we have an NGO that would very much appreciate Thunberg's sober and flat delivery style. The climate mobilization, founded in 2014 at the People's Climate March, the founder and executive director of this U.S. NGO is psychologist Margaret Klein Solomon. The climate mobilization has one primary goal, quote, our mission is to save civilization. To do so, Solomon outlines a wartime-style mobilization, akin to the American home front effort during World War II. Salomon's strength as a psychologist specializing in climate change is exactly what Annex 1 states across the world are now embracing via the establishment of nudge units, and that's in quotes. That is, the implementation and use of behavioral science for policy within government. And here's a quick quote. Salomon earned her PhD in clinical psychology from Adelphi University and also holds a BA in social anthropology from Harvard. Via climate mobilization, Salomon applies her psychological and anthropological knowledge to solving climate change. She is the author of the blog The Climate Psychologist, and that's linked. And that's end quote. The 2014 People's Climate March, linked, was organized by the Global Call for Climate Action, or Tick Tick Tick, and that's linked as well. Climate Nexus, which is dedicated to changing the conversation on climate change, also linked. 350.org, USCAN, and Avaz/Purpose, and these are all linked. At the helm of this NGO assemblage was the Rockefeller Brothers Fund, working with the V.K. Rasmussen Foundation. Additionally, Climate Nexus is a sponsored project of Rockefeller Philanthropy Advisors, a 501c3 organization. And here's a quick quote from them. Quote, "When the climate mobilization was founded at the People's Climate March in 2014, there was no climate group publicly organizing around the need for World War II-scale emergency speed transition. Since then, we've worked to establish an active emergency climate movement wing of the broader climate movement." End quote. 11 of the Climate Mobilization Advisory Board members include Betsy Taylor, president of Breakthrough Strategies and Solutions consulting firm, co-founder of One Sky, which is financed by the Clinton Global Initiative, that merged with 350.org, incubated by the Rockefeller Brothers Foundation, in 2011. Advisory boards include 350.org and Ceres, which is a 350.org investment partner. Then we have Laura Dawn Murphy, former creative director for MoveOn.org, which is a parent company of Avaz. Paul Gilding, former executive director of Greenpeace International, strategy advisor and founder of Changing Markets Foundation. Quick quote from them. The Changing Markets Foundation was formed to accelerate and scale up solutions to sustainability challenges by leveraging the power of markets. End quote. Clients include Unilever, BHP Billiton, DSM, Ford, and DuPont. Then we have Jamila Rakib, Executive Director of Albert Einstein Institute. Quick quote there. Rakib has worked with Dr. Gene Sharp, the world's foremost scholar on strategic nonviolent action, since 2002. As the director of the Albert Einstein Institute, she promotes the study and use of strategic nonviolent action. End quote. Then we have Gus Speth, founder of the World Resources Institute and co-founder of the National Resources Defense Council. Reverend Lennox Yearwood Jr., president of the Hip Hop Caucus. Richard Heinberg, senior fellow of the Post-Carbon Institute. Lise Van Susteren, American psychiatrist named to the board of directors of Al Gore's The Climate Project in 2009, organized the first conference to focus on the psychological impacts of climate change in 2009. Co-authored a paper called The Psychological Effects of Climate Change, which was published by the National Wildlife Federation, where she serves on the board. Then we have Michael Mann, not the film director, an American climate scientist. And we have David Spratt and Philip Sutton. Spratt is the director of Breakthrough, National Center for Climate Restoration. And to give you some background on them, Breakthrough collaborates with the Club of Rome, which was mentioned in one of her previous pieces. Spratt and Sutton co-authored the book Climate Code Red in 2008. And then Cory has also included a full list of links to the Climate Mobilization Advisory Board. But those are some of the most high-profile members. The interlocking directorate of the nonprofit industrial complex is extensive. As this series focuses on the marketing strategy itself, more than those constructing it, the above bios are purposefully brief. The climate mobilization's foray into politics began with Mobilize California. It was a campaign. Leading the effort with the climate mobilization was Naomi Klein and her LEAP NGO, which is called LEAP LA Coalition, as well as a coalition of like-minded organizations. The coalition, in partnership with Los Angeles City Council member Paul Koretz, sought to initiate a World War II-scale climate mobilization of LA. And here she's included an embedded video of Naomi Klein at the launch of this event. By May 2018, the Council voted unanimously to, quote, explore the establishment of the country's first climate emergency mobilization department and set aside $500,000 in seed money toward the effort. In June 2018, Berkeley declared a climate emergency and committed to an emergency climate mobilization and just transition to end greenhouse gas emissions and begin drawing down the excess carbon in the atmosphere as quickly as possible. Other cities would soon follow. Here it is critical to note the language. Drawing down the excess carbon in the atmosphere. Long gone are discussions on reducing or cutting carbon emissions. This is not coincidence. Rather, it is again strategic. 2 days prior to the 2014 People's Climate March, on September 19, 2014, the article titled "The Founder of the Climate Mobilization Talks with Bridget Reed About How Psychology, Not Science, May Be the Key to Ending America's Climate Denial." And it reported the following, and here's a quote. In 356 words, the climate mobilization's pledge to mobilize calls on the United States government to commence a World War II-scale mobilization to fight climate change, to decrease our net greenhouse gas emissions by 100% by 2025, to deploy a system of removing greenhouse gases from the atmosphere with wartime speed, and to make reducing net GHGs 100% globally with the same swiftness a top political priority, end quote. The climate mobilization's influence within the nonprofit industrial complex is articulated in the following text outlining its groundwork with the U.S. Democratic Party platform, as well as the Green New Deal. And here's another quick quote. The evidence of impact is clear. As assertive wings of the Democratic Party, as well as chapters of organizations such as 350.org and the Sierra Club, adopt our prescriptions as core demands. Congresswoman Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez signed our pledge to mobilize and has been outspoken specifically for the need for emergency mobilization as part of the push for a House Select Committee on the Green New Deal, end quote. Today's redesigning of our Western subjugation is nothing different than what has been unveiled in the past. Whereas education, health, arts, and all sectors of society were shaped and financed by foundations and their capital largesse, today's fourth industrial revolution remains in the clutches of the ruling elite. This includes the 2014 People's Climate March, where the climate mobilization was born. Extinction Rebellion, to be discussed in Part 5 of this series, has three very broad demands, and she's included a link to those demands. The primary one being that governments must, quote, enact legally binding policy measures to reduce carbon emissions to net zero by 2025, end quote. Echoing the talking points brought into the mainstream by the nonprofit industrial complex, the World Bank, and others in 2014, and she's included links for those as well. The term net zero emissions does not mean zero emissions. Rather, it is the amount of emissions being put into the atmosphere being equal to the amount being, quote, captured. Net zero, therefore, the requirements for massive investments into the technologies being developed and rolled out by Bill Gates' Mission Innovation, linked. For an example of this, one can read the much-lauded Off Fossil Fuels for a Better Future Act, which is linked here. Section 101-5, quote, we must significantly increase federal research and development funding to develop and deploy the technologies needed for deep decarbonization in our economy. This was a proposal announced at the Paris Climate Accord with Bill Gates called Mission Innovation, which committed to double government investment in energy technology. Here it is vital to recognize that World Economic Forum and Mission Innovation formed a partnership on June 1st, 2017, and there's a link to that. Net zero is carbon capture storage, and a host of other technologies that promise business and emissions will continue as usual. Consider the reality that while we are inundated with anti-pipeline protest coverage, there is zero opposition to the carbon capture projects that are slowly coming online, such as the Alberta Carbon Trunk Line in Canada, and she's linked to that. Indeed, the inconvenient zero emissions and near zero terminology in the 2014 AR5 synthesis report was conveniently transformed to the net zero term we now see in the public realm, barely missing a beat. But the real question is how to save capitalism, which is described as being now in free fall. And there's a link for that. With capitalism in danger of falling apart, a rare, cryptically honest quote from Al Gore, and years of stagnant global economic growth now in free fall, the Greta campaign must be understood for what it is: an elaborate distraction that has nothing to do with protecting the natural world, and everything to do with the manufacturing of consent. The required consent of the citizenry that will unlock the treasuries and public monies under the guise of climate protection. But before we go further into what we can aptly describe as a politically correct and unprecedented global bailout, we must look at how collective society can be successfully manipulated and maneuvered in order to sanction the release of the funds. The very strategy to unlock the public purse and thus save capitalism itself is that of a climate emergency. And here she's listed a whole bunch of hashtags: climate strike, Fridays for the future, Extinction Rebellion, and climate emergency. Leading the public into emergency mode. Our house is on fire. And here's a quote from The Nation magazine. If you don't know who Swedish teenager Greta Thunberg is, you can think of her as an international climate change counterpart to Representative Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez. Like the rock star congresswoman from New York, Thunberg is a charismatic young woman whose social media savvy, moral clarity, and fearless speaking truth to power have inspired throngs of admirers to take to the streets for a better world and call out the politicians and CEOs who are standing in the way. Thunberg claimed on her Twitter feed that there have been student strikes for climate on every continent except Antarctica, 70,000 strikers in total last week. Meanwhile, the Swedish teenager continued to blast the elites in Davos in flawless English. And here's a quote from Greta. Adults keep saying we owe it to the young people to give them hope. But I don't want your hope. I want you to act as if you would in a crisis. I want you to act as if the house is on fire, because it is. And that's an end quote from Greta Thunberg, and this piece came out in The Nation in an article called The Kids Are Coming, January 28, 2019. Leading the public into emergency mode, a new strategy for the climate movement. In April 2016, the Climate Mobilization published the paper, quote, Leading the Public into Emergency Mode, a New Strategy for the Climate Movement, and that's linked. The strategy document leads with, quote, Imagine there's a fire in your house. What do you do? What do you think about? You do whatever you can to try to put out the fire or exit the house. You make a plan about how you can put out the fire, or how you can best exit the house. Our senses are heightened, you're focused like a laser, and you put your entire self into your actions. You enter emergency mode, and that's from page 2 of that paper. In the document, Solomon, who's the psychiatrist that she mentions earlier in this piece, introduces the concept of emergency mode, which is how individuals and groups function optimally during an existential or moral crisis, often achieving great feats through intensely focused motivation. She articulates that, quote, the goal of the climate movement must be to lead the public out of normal mode and into emergency mode. The emergency mode is enacted by the triggering of a switch. And here's a quote from the paper. This has huge implications for the climate movement's communication style, advocacy, and strategy. Because emergency mode is contagious. The best strategy is for climate activists and organizations to go into emergency mode themselves and communicate about the climate emergency, the need for emergency mobilization, and the fact that they are in emergency mode, as clearly and emphatically as possible." End quote. And now in 2019, we see how the strategy as laid out in the paper has now been deployed in real time in real life. And here's a quote from The Dangerous Power of Emotional Advertising from April 14th, 2016. And the quote is, "Since emotional ads create a deeper and more visceral impression on the memory centers of the brain, marketers are now measuring more cerebral responses to content using neurometric tools like facial coding, implicit response testing, eye tracking, and magnetic resonance imaging, or called MRI. I can attest to this. I've worked in advertising, and this has become increasingly prevalent. Below, she's shown a video from January 25th of Greta Thunberg, her special address at the annual meeting of the World Economic Forum, which I think is in addition to the supposed impromptu speech, and a whole variety of photos and tweets from that event. Let's see here. Let me get through those and get back to Cory's article. But there are tweets, embedded videos, pieces from The Guardian, and other high-profile publications. January 25th. Feel the fear. Climate change is now the talk of Davos, from CNN. The spirit of the event was reflected in two attendees with little in common. One is a former vice president of the United States, the other a 16-year-old Swedish schoolgirl. What Al Gore and Greta Thunberg share is anger at corporate executives who aren't moving quickly enough to address climate change. "I don't want you to be hopeful. I want you to panic. I want you to feel the fear I feel every day," Thunberg told attendees. I think obviously Cory has included that quote to just show you how the verbiage from that theoretical paper written by Solomon has made its way into the talking points of Greta Thunberg. The crux of the strategy document. The crux of the strategy document leading the public into emergency mode, a new strategy for the climate movement, is that citizens must first face, then accept, that there is a life-threatening emergency in order to go into the necessary emergency mode. Once triggered, this enables the deployment of a huge amount of resources towards solving the crisis, which would quickly become the clear top priority for society. That's from pages 4 and 5 of the report. The more the climate movement provides structure for people's engagement, clear directions, and support for people who are ready to tackle the climate emergency, the more people will go into emergency mode, and that's from page 7. Whereas budget restraint occurs in non-emergency mode, in emergency mode, all available necessary resources are devoted to the emergency, and if necessary, governments borrow heavily. And that's a quote from page 9. A longer quote from the report. "Economic mobilization is an emergency restructuring of a modern industrial economy, accomplished at rapid speed. It involves the vast majority of citizens, the utilization of a very high proportion of available resources, and impacts all areas of society. It is nothing less than a government-coordinated social and industrial revolution. Mobilization is what happens when an entire nation enters emergency mode, and the results can be truly staggering." And that's from page 8. Intentional or not, Solomon's paper weighs heavy with American exceptionalism. Notes of nationalism and cultural superiority waft throughout the document. Quote, "We also made huge advances in the sciences. The first computer was invented, as were blood transfusion and radar technology. The Manhattan Project successfully built the world's first atomic bomb in less than 3 years. A morally catastrophic but nonetheless stupendous feat of planning, cooperation, and scientific ingenuity." End quote. Reflecting the aforementioned observations, gone is the language to reduce or stop emissions. Consider the word stop does not appear once in the document, while the word reduce has one single entry. And that's a quote from the piece again. Quote, "If we only reduce the fossil fuel industry's stranglehold on politicians, the problem will solve itself." And that's from page 23. Today's gently persuasive language is a mirror image of the language and demands drawn out in the strategy document. Quote, "Restore a safe and stable climate." Quote, "Draw down excess CO2." And quote, "Cool the planet." And then from page 14, "The way we respond to threats, by entering emergency mode or by remaining in normal mode, is highly contagious. Imagine the fire alarm going off in an office building. How seriously should you take it? How do you know if it's a drill or a real fire? Those questions will be predominantly answered by the actions and communications of the people around you, particularly people designated as leaders. If they are chatting and taking their time exiting the building, you will assume that this is a drill. If people are moving with haste, faces stern and focused, communicating with urgency and gravity, you will assume there's real danger and exit as quickly as possible." That's from page 14. The document acknowledges that the climate crisis is a, quote, "top threat to the global economy," and that's linked. She's highlighted that in red. It's from page 21 of the document. What is not stated, yet understood, is the fact that the climate can also be exploited to salvage the global economy, in essence, to save capitalism. And a quote from page 22, "We cannot be silent about the fact that emergency mobilization can only be coordinated by a big government that is granted the power to spend without limit to save as much life as possible." The document also outlines a cheerful camaraderie with the oppressors of the working class and those most marginalized. Quote, "These pressure campaigns should escalate in degrees of assertiveness, all the way to disruptive protest. However, even in a protest, we must maintain an open, welcoming attitude. Thus, while we will need to be quite confrontational and unwavering, we are not against our targets of protest. We gain nothing from demonizing them. We need these leaders to do the right thing. The tone should not be primarily angry, but urgent and insistent. Rather, the tone should be serious and patriotic. We are calling on America to lead the world in heroic, world-saving action. Protests should involve elements of protest or sacrifice, such as risking arrest or hunger strike, to generate empathy from the public. Maintaining strict nonviolence is critical to winning widespread public support and is non-negotiable." And that's from page 28 of the document. This document is astonishing in many ways. Not once does the author pause to reflect upon what specific societies and nations benefit from industrial civilization on our finite planet, and which ones are sacrificed for the same cause. The said purpose of the strategy is not the protection of what remains of the natural world, but rather to save organized civilization, from page 2, and our functioning global civilization, page 21. The root word of civilization is civil, and there's nothing civil about the industrial civilization we've built. The savagery of our global economic system, unleashed upon the biosphere and both sentient and non-white human life, is certainly nothing to boast about, and certainly nothing to protect. It is the global capitalist economic system that upholds industrial civilization, which must be deconstructed. It is both ironic and telling that even the societies who have benefited the most from industrialization, those in the West, and especially in North America, have never been more miserable. Today we witness an unprecedented crisis of mental illness and depression, with a massive percentage of society now dependent upon antidepressant pharmaceuticals in order to function in a day-to-day existence. Yet the most egregious aspect of this document is that despite the references to Pearl Harbor, the atomic bomb, and American war efforts of countless stripes, all cited as glowing examples of American ingenuity, nowhere is the militarism's impact on both climate and ecology mentioned. Consider the U.S. Department of Defense is the largest consumer of oil in the U.S. and the largest institutional consumer of oil in the world. With militarism's phenomenal contribution to global greenhouse gas emissions, and environmental degradation, this omission is beyond the pale, to say the least. This is the unspoken environmental racism and blatant eco-imperialism that hums beneath the foundational building blocks of the nonprofit industrial complex. And here's another quote. Here's the awful truth. Even if every person, every automobile, and every factory suddenly emitted zero emissions, the Earth would still be headed head first and at full speed toward total disaster for one major reason. The military produces enough greenhouse gases by itself to place the entire globe, with all its inhabitants large and small, in the most imminent danger of extinction. And that is from The Green Zone, The Environmental Costs of Militarism by Barry Sanders. It's from May 1st, 2009. And it's also part of the Environment of Militarism podcast, both of which she's linked here in the article and are well worth visiting. The power of conformity is a key aspect of social engineering. Its power is tragically often overlooked and grossly underestimated. From page 30 of the report, quote, "Thought leaders and leaders of civil society. If the people in the public eye and in the public esteem go into emergency mode, they will significantly influence the broader public." And that's from page 30. And then she's embedded a whole bunch of tweets, one from Naomi Klein from November of 2018, saying the climate clock has struck midnight, and it's talking about towns declaring a climate emergency. She's got tweets from the climate mobilization, talking about city governments declaring climate emergencies. That's from the end of January of this year, and a bunch of others worth taking a look at. The race to mobilize is on. Cities around the globe are declaring climate emergency and committing to climate mobilization. Will your city join them? And that's from the Climate Mobilization website. Of no surprise whatsoever is the fact that since Extinction Rebellion's meteoric rise to stardom, in perfect symmetry with Thunberg, the group has announced a massive restructuring of the organization. The global expansion is being led by Solomon, and there's a link for that, who launched the Extinction Rebellion U.S. Twitter account on October 31st, 2018, the same day as the launch of Extinction Rebellion in the UK. The accompanying U.S. website would launch November 3rd, 2018, and the U.S. Facebook group account would launch on November 4th, 2018. Between the official launch on October 31st, 2018 in the UK to December 6, 2018, it grew to over 130 groups across 22 countries. By January 29, 2019, the Extinction Rebellion groups spanned across 50 countries. The Extinction Rebellion's demands are not only complementary to the climate mobilization's emergency strategy, they're a mirror image of it, with the slogan, quote, "Tell the truth." The September 20, 2018 Yale Climate Connections article, "Climate Mobilization Plea, Cities Must Declare Emergency," references the climate emergency language gaining momentum in perfect stride with a cohesion of intersecting campaigns: the Thunberg campaign, the Extinction Rebellion protests, the Green New Deal, the general climate strikes, and the Fridays for Future youth climate strikes. Here's a quote. Sanders, an independent who caucuses with the Democrats and ran for the Democratic nomination, isn't the only politician drawing parallels between climate change and fascist aggression. New York Democrat Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez, who has been hailed as an up-and-coming progressive champion, has spoken about the need for a World War II-style commitment to fighting global warming. The Democratic Party in 2016 included similar language in its official platform. The injection of this messaging into American political discourse can be traced in part to the Climate Mobilization, a largely volunteer-run nonprofit founded in 2014. End quote. From August 15th, 2016. We're under attack from climate change, and our only hope is to mobilize like we did in World War II. That's a quote from 350.org founder Bill McKibben, with an illustration accompanying it. And here's a longer quote. I assume that many activists will continue to be drawn to fossil fuel infrastructure protests. I recommend to them that they work as hard as possible to communicate the way forward. Emergency mobilization off fossil fuels and carbon-intensive agriculture, plus carbon drawdown to cool the earth back to a safe level. As much as possible in their verbal and nonverbal communications. This can be as simple as wearing Rosie the Riveter bandanas while protesting, displaying a banner demanding World War II scale climate mobilization to restore a safe climate, and including the demand for net zero emissions by 2025, plus large-scale drawdown in press releases and web materials. And that quote is from April 2016, a document called Leading the Public into Emergency Mode, a New Strategy for the Climate Movement. So that's the same document that she's been referencing to some length here throughout this section of the piece. She's also embedded a video made by the climate mobilization that's worth taking a look at. It's just a 2-minute video they did to promote their work. A climate of fear. Capitalism is now in free fall. Capitalism is in crisis, says World Economic Forum founder Klaus Schwab, and that's from January 17, 2017. Leading up to the January 2019 Davos gathering, a top Wall Street economist warned investors that they face a tough road ahead with global economic growth now in free fall. The current headlines read like Orson Welles' economic version of War of the Worlds. From January 3, 2019 in the Globe and Mail. Global economic growth now in free fall. Merrill Lynch strategist Ajay Singh Kapoor recently wrote that global economic growth is now in a broad, deep, and persistent slowdown, creating market conditions that I believe will make life treacherous for commodity sectors and beyond. Since August 2017, growth in manufacturing activity has been decelerating rapidly, dragging metal prices with them. From January 15, 2019. Global economic growth is slowing, including in Canada, according to new data from the Organization for Economic Cooperation and Development. January 21, 19. IMF CEOs warn of slowing world economy on eve of Davos summit. Corporate executives joined the International Monetary Fund in warning the global economy is slowing faster than expected, establishing a downbeat tone for this week's annual meeting of the World Economic Forum. Also from January 21, 2019, China's 6.6% growth in 2018 is its slowest in nearly 3 decades. February 1, 2019, world's largest pension fund loses $136 billion in 3 months. To the rescue, a politically correct bailout, the Climate Finance Partnership. And here's a quote. Unlocking the inclusive growth story of the 21st century, accelerating climate action in urgent times, this is our use it or lose it moment. Investing the US $90 trillion to build the right infrastructure now will deliver a new era of economic growth. Investing it wisely will help drive innovation, deliver public health benefits, create a host of new jobs, and go a long way to tackling the risks of runaway climate change. Getting it wrong, on the other hand, will lock us into a high-polluting, low-productivity, and deeply unequal future. And that's from the New Climate Economy website, and that's their executive summary. Linked here. Following the September 8, 2018 Rise for Climate mobilization, a follow-up to the People's Climate March 2014, having been rebranded to the People's Climate Movement in 2017, the single goal behind the accelerating climate emergency language was finally unveiled at the September 26, 2018 One Planet Summit in New York, and that's linked here. And here's a quote from that event. Efforts to blend capital in order to engage and mobilize large-scale institutional capital toward climate solutions took a notable step forward on September 26th at the One Planet Summit in New York, when French President Emmanuel Macron and BlackRock's Larry Fink announced the Climate Finance Partnership. The Climate Finance Partnership consists of a unique combination of philanthropies, governments, institutional investors, and a leading global asset manager. The parties, including BlackRock, the governments of France and Germany, and the Hewlett, Grantham, and IKEA foundations have committed to work together to finalize the design and structure of what we anticipate will be a flagship blended capital investment vehicle by the end of the first quarter 2019. Interesting. From September 26, 2018, governments and philanthropies announced groundbreaking partnership with BlackRock to mobilize and deploy climate finance at scale. And a quick quote from that piece. France, Germany, the Hewlett, Grantham, and IKEA foundations, and asset manager BlackRock today announced the Climate Finance Partnership at the One Planet Summit in New York. The Climate Finance Partnership is an unprecedented cooperative between philanthropies, governments, and private investors, which have committed to jointly developing an investment vehicle that will aim to invest in climate infrastructure in emerging markets. The two institutions identified as the media contacts for the above unprecedented announcement are the European Climate Foundation and the aforementioned Climate Nexus, a lead organizer for the 2014 People's Climate March, and there are links for all this. On November 8, 2018, the article The Climate Finance Partnership, Mobilizing Institutional Capital to Address the Climate Opportunity, discloses where the money will come from for the fourth industrial revolution, sold to the public under the guise of sustainability. And here is a lengthy quote. Nowhere is the investment gap between what is needed and what is currently flowing greater and more urgent, or the opportunities more significant than in the world's developing and emerging markets. These economies are generally characterized by growing populations, rapidly increasing energy demand, and extraordinary infrastructure investment needs. But they also tend to have less developed capital markets and higher political and regulatory risk than their developed country counterparts. Institutional investors may therefore be partially forgiven for moving cautiously, even in the face of compelling long-term economic and demographic drivers. A detailed analysis by the World Bank found that while $100 trillion is held by pension funds and other institutional investors, these same investors allocated less than $2 trillion over a 25-year period into infrastructure investment in emerging markets. And the fraction of that investment that could be considered green, clean, or climate-friendly was negligible. So what can be done? Whether you choose to look through the lens of unprecedented challenge or unprecedented opportunity, there's a violent agreement that institutional capital needs to be unlocked, and this is a favorite word on the climate conference circuit, and mobilized quickly and at scale. End quote. It is here that the accelerating demand for countries to align with the Paris Agreement becomes clear. The Paris Agreement requires us to align finance flows in support for a low-carbon and climate-resilient development. And that's a quote. Note the word requires. What was considered non-binding one moment conveniently becomes binding when it involves opening up the treasuries and pension plans to our corporate overlords. No risk, all reward. The doublespeak of Wall Street is deliberately opaque. Yet in layman's terms, these are simply high finance words to say there's less risk in using someone else's money other than your own. And here's another quote. Blended finance, or the strategic deployment of public or other concessional capital to de-risk institutional capital investment, offers one compelling answer. Recently, the Blended Finance Task Force, a broad-based interdisciplinary effort, finalized a comprehensive report identifying key barriers to large-scale institutional capital mobilization toward the Sustainable Development Goals, and then subsequently designed a detailed action program to address these barriers, and there's links for all of these references. The Blended Finance Task Force comprises 50 icons of finance, including HSBC, Credit Suisse, Citi, JP Morgan Chase, USAID, the World Economic Forum, Sustainable Development Investment Partnership, the World Bank, Investec, the MacArthur Foundation, Allianz, EBRD, ClimateWorks, founded by the Hewlett-Packard and McKnight Foundations, and the Rockefeller Foundation. And there's a full list that she's linked to as well. Another quote. The partnership coordinated by the Task Force on Philanthropic Innovation and the Aligned Intermediary and Investment Advisory Group was designed and structured specifically to use a layer of government and philanthropic capital to maximize private capital mobilization toward climate-related sectors in emerging markets. And she's got a link to that for where that quote comes from. And here again is where more stark reality is faintly disclosed, and she has another quote. Doing so in partnership with the world's largest manager and its set of world-class institutional investor clients should send an important signal to fund managers and institutional investors alike that there are profits to be had in sectors and geographies where this capital has not been historically deployed. The partnership will seek to make investments in a targeted set of sectors including renewable energy, energy efficiency, energy storage, and low-carbon and electrified transportation across 3 regions, including Latin America, Asia, and Africa. End quote. Today's climate emergency mobilization must be recognized for what it is: a strategically orchestrated campaign financed and managed by the world's most powerful institutions for the preservation of capitalism and global economic growth. This is the launch of a new growth industry in the global south, coupled with the creation of new and untapped markets. Leading up to this precipice, the B Team, the Open Society Foundation, Oxfam, and many others that serve as the human face of capitalism have moved their offices to or set up new divisions in both Africa and Latin America. Also of threat to Western imperialism is a burgeoning China. And to be clear, there will be no fourth industrial revolution for the Western ruling class without uninterrupted and perpetual access to Africa's bounty of rare earth minerals and metals. And there's a quick quote here from the World Economic Forum from this year. While significant progress has been made on Africa's political and economic transformation, the continent continues to face significant challenges. Geopolitically, new economic alliances are altering traditional relationships and spheres of influence. End quote. Think they're referring to China there? As we know that China has done massive investment in Africa in the last few years. The sycophantic NGOs, in servitude indeed on the very same team as their corporate benefactors, created a literal, albeit virtual, firestorm, encapsulated in the mantra, "Our house is on fire," in order to instigate a, quote, climate revolution. The collective energy of the West, stemming from a growing societal discontent, is being captured and utilized, transcending into a new weapon of choice that will aid the further colonization of the global South. A climate revolution in name only. This said emergency has nothing to do with the protection of our Earth or climate, and it never will. Rather, it has everything to do with saving, protecting, and expanding the capitalist economy at the expense of our already decimated planet. And nothing more than that. This oncoming new onslaught of environmental devastation and plunder, in the name of climate revolution, will make all of modern man's historical violence against nature, up to this point, seem like childish prattle. Yet none of this should come as a surprise. As the oligarchs financed, shaped, and largely managed the climate movement, it's only natural that they alone benefit from it. The power elites repackaged our oppression as revolution and sold it back to us. By exploiting the innocent youth, which in turn exploited our emotions and fears as a collective populace, we devoured it. And soon, young Greta and all the youth they have exploited will be thrown under the bus. It's all par for the course under capitalism. All right, thanks for listening, everyone. We will be moving on to read Act 5 in the near future, probably next week. We're going to take a break in between these different sections of Cory Morningstar's extensive series to read another piece by Susie Dawson, and that's what I'll be doing next, either at the end of this week or on Monday of next week. She referenced a really lengthy piece that she did a while back called Understanding World War III in one of her recent broadcasts for her campaign, 1 versus 5I. And that is a really quite extraordinary piece of work that I read sometime in the last couple of years. I've actually read it a couple of times, and I think will be very helpful and very interesting set of insights to include for the podcast series next. So anticipate that, and then we'll get back to Cory after we do some more Susie Dawson. Thanks again.